Ethan Carter had always been a man of routine. At 56, he had spent the better part of his life as a civil engineer, designing bridges and buildings that stood as testaments to his meticulous nature. His life was one of order, discipline, and a quiet solitude that he had come to cherish. His home, a modest two-story house in the serene neighborhood of Willow Creek, was his sanctuary. It was a place where he could retreat from the chaos of the world, a place where he could find peace. But peace, as Ethan would soon discover, is a fragile thing. Ethan had never been one for drama. He didn't seek attention, nor did he crave the company of others. His interactions with his neighbors were polite but distant. He didn't attend community meetings, didn't engage in the petty disputes that seemed to consume those around him. He was content to live his life in quiet isolation, focusing on his work and his recovery from a recent heart surgery that had left him more cautious than ever. His doctor had been clear. Ethan's body was still adjusting, and he needed to avoid unnecessary stress. So he had organized his life around routine checkups, prescribed medication, and the maintenance of a stable environment. What he hadn't accounted for, however, was the unpredictable and often absurd behavior of those who lived around him. Martha Collins was Ethan's next-door neighbor, and she was everything he wasn't. Loud, brash, and perpetually meddling in the affairs of others, Martha had a reputation that extended far beyond Willow Creek. A retired schoolteacher with a penchant for control, she had an unshakable belief that the world should operate according to her rules. She was the kind of woman who could turn a simple disagreement into a full-blown feud, and she had a knack for making everyone around her miserable. Ethan had had his fair share of run-ins with Martha over the years. Once, she had knocked on his door to complain that his outdoor lights were too bright, even though they were well within the allowed limits. Another time, she had passive-aggressively asked if he was aware that the leaves from his tree had fallen into her yard, as if he had personally instructed them to do so. But the worst incident had been when she had reported his truck as an eyesore to the community board, insisting that it lowered property values. Ethan had never allowed Martha to get under his skin. He didn't react to her complaints, didn't feed into her attempts to start arguments, and certainly didn't seek revenge. He preferred to ignore her, believing that it wasn't worth the energy. But that night, ignoring Martha Collins would no longer be an option. It started with a sharp, stabbing pain in Ethan's chest that jolted him awake. At first, he thought it was nothing more than an uncomfortable sleeping position, but as he tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness washed over him. His hands felt cold, his vision blurred, and an overwhelming tightness gripped his chest like a vice. Ethan had experienced minor discomfort before. His doctors had warned him about occasional irregularities in his recovery, but this was different. This was something far worse. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, but his fingers felt unsteady, clumsy. His breath was shallow, and each inhale felt insufficient, as though he wasn't getting enough oxygen. Panic started to creep into the edges of his mind. His doctor had specifically told him what to look out for: persistent chest pain, shortness of breath, dizziness, cold sweats. All of it was happening now. He couldn't ignore it. With what little strength he had, Ethan managed to unlock his phone and tap the emergency call button. The dispatcher's voice sounded distant, but he could make out her words. She asked him to confirm his symptoms, his address, his condition. He forced himself to answer, though each word felt heavier than the last. She assured him that an ambulance was already on the way, then instructed him to unlock his front door so the paramedics wouldn't have to waste time forcing entry. The effort to stand was almost unbearable. His knees nearly buckled beneath him, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might collapse before even making it to the door. He steadied himself against the wall, took slow, measured breaths, and forced his body forward, step by agonizing step. By the time he reached the entrance, he could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching. He turned the lock, barely managing to twist the knob before stumbling backward and sinking onto the couch. The red and white flashes of the ambulance lights filled the street as the vehicle pulled up in front of his home. The paramedics wasted no time. They were out of the vehicle within seconds, carrying equipment as they rushed toward his door. But before they could even reach the entrance, another sound cut through the night, a woman's voice, loud and angry. "Move your damn truck. I can't even get out of my own driveway." Ethan barely registered the words at first, his mind clouded by pain and exhaustion. But as the shouting continued, it became impossible to ignore. "This is ridiculous," the voice continued, cutting through the night like nails on a chalkboard. "You can't just block people in like this. What if I had an emergency?" One of the paramedics, a man in his mid-30s with a professional but firm demeanor, glanced at the source of the noise before responding. "Ma'am, we're responding to a medical emergency. We'll only be here for a short time." Martha scoffed, shaking her head. "That's not the point. You can't just park wherever you want. I pay good money to live here, and I won't have some government vehicle taking up space in front of my house." The medic didn't argue further, turning his attention back to the situation at hand. But Martha wasn't done. As the other paramedic entered the house, the first one jogged back to the ambulance to grab additional equipment. It was then that he heard it, the unmistakable sound of something hard striking the side of the vehicle. A second later, another impact. By the time he turned around, he saw Martha gripping a large flashlight in one hand, its heavy metal body now smeared with streaks of chipped paint from where she had struck the ambulance. Her face was a mask of unrepentant fury, as though she had every right to do what she had just done. The paramedic's shock was evident, but before he could react, Martha turned sharply and stormed back toward her house, muttering under her breath. Inside, Ethan was barely conscious, unaware that while his body was fighting to keep him alive, his lunatic neighbor had just escalated something far beyond the realm of mere annoyance. Chapter 4: The Aftermath. The paramedic stood frozen for a moment, staring at the damage Martha had just inflicted on the ambulance. The fresh scratches on the side panel, the dented metal where she had slammed her flashlight, the faint but deliberate malice in her actions had all painted a picture that was as absurd as it was infuriating. He had encountered difficult bystanders before, people who were panicked, emotional, or simply overwhelmed by an emergency situation. But this was different. This was someone who had no concern for anything beyond her own personal bubble of control. Someone who saw a man's life hanging in the balance and still decided that her own inconvenience was the more pressing matter. His instinct was to confront her, to demand an explanation, to let her know in no uncertain terms that what she had done was criminal. But there was no time for that now. Ethan Carter was inside, barely holding on, and that was the priority. He took a deep breath, forced himself to push down his frustration, and turned back to the job at hand. His partner had already hooked Ethan up to an oxygen mask, running diagnostics, and preparing him for transport. The signs were concerning. Ethan's blood pressure was dangerously low, his skin was clammy, and his heart rate was erratic. It was clear that he needed to be stabilized as soon as possible. "Let's move," the paramedic said, his voice clipped and professional, though his hands still trembled slightly from the anger simmering beneath his skin. Ethan was barely conscious as they lifted him onto the stretcher, his eyelids fluttering as he struggled to stay aware of what was happening. He felt hands gripping him firmly but carefully, voices murmuring things he couldn't quite process. The world around him was fading in and out, a disjointed series of images, flashing red lights, the dim outline of his living room, the shadowy figure of someone standing near the doorway. He couldn't tell if it was real or if his oxygen-starved brain was simply filling in the gaps. As they maneuvered the stretcher toward the ambulance, Martha reappeared, standing at the edge of her driveway with her arms still crossed, watching the scene unfold with an expression that was equal parts annoyance and self-righteous indignation. The sheer audacity of her presence, the way she made no attempt to hide the fact that she was judging the situation, made the paramedic's blood boil. "Is this really necessary?" she muttered, just loud enough for them to hear. "I mean, he's awake, isn't he? You don't need to make such a production out of it." The paramedic ignored her, focusing on securing Ethan into the vehicle, making sure the four-line was in place, ensuring that every precaution was taken. His partner was already radioing the hospital, giving them a rundown of Ethan's condition, relaying critical information to the emergency room staff so they would be prepared upon arrival. Every second counted, but Martha wouldn't let it go. "Are you at least going to move that thing when you leave? Because I swear to God, if I have to wake up tomorrow morning and see scratches on my pavement." The paramedic finally snapped. He turned his head just slightly, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, and leveled her with a look so cold it could have frozen her in place. "Lady, shut the hell up," he said, his voice low, controlled. but dripping with fury. Martha's mouth opened slightly, her face twisting into an expression of pure outrage, as if she had just been struck across the face. "Excuse me," she gasped. The paramedic didn't respond. He didn't have time for this, and he certainly didn't have the patience. Instead, he climbed into the ambulance, slamming the doors shut behind him. The ride to the hospital was tense, not because of Ethan, who was stable for now thanks to the 4 fluids and oxygen, but because the paramedic couldn't stop replaying what had just happened in his mind. He had been in this line of work for over a decade. He had seen people at their most vulnerable, their most terrified, their most desperate. But he had never seen someone so deliberately heartless, so blatantly unconcerned with human life. By the time they arrived at the hospital, Ethan had faded into a semi-conscious state. The ER staff was ready for him, wheeling him into a treatment room with practiced efficiency. The paramedics gave their report, detailing his symptoms, the intervention they had provided, and his response to treatment so far. The doctors and nurses took over immediately, working to determine whether the crisis had passed or if more serious measures needed to be taken. It wasn't until the paramedic was back in the ambulance, staring at the scratches Martha had left behind, that he fully allowed himself to process what had happened. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, and made a decision. He pulled out his phone and called his supervisor. "We've got a problem," he said, "and I want to report it." The next morning, when Ethan finally woke up properly, groggy but alive, he had no idea what had transpired outside his house. He didn't know that Martha had vandalized the ambulance, that she had berated the paramedics in the middle of a life-threatening emergency, that she had made a fool of herself in a way that had left an entire crew of medical professionals shaking their heads in disbelief. He only knew that he was in a hospital bed, that there was an IV in his arm, that his heart still beat in his chest. And then he saw the man sitting in the chair by the window, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Good morning," the paramedic said. Ethan blinked, still foggy from the medication. "Do I know you?" The paramedic leaned forward slightly, studying him. "I was the one who helped get you here last night." Something about his tone sent a ripple of unease through Ethan's chest. There was something more beneath those words, something unspoken but heavy. "You feeling okay?" the paramedic asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ethan nodded slowly. "I think so." The paramedic nodded once, then sighed. "Good. Because we need to talk about your neighbor." At first, Ethan didn't understand. His brain was still catching up, still piecing together the fragmented events of the night before. He remembered the pain, the panic, the sirens. But his neighbor? What did Martha have to do with anything? Then the paramedic took out his phone, scrolled through something, and turned the screen toward Ethan. It was a photo, the ambulance, the scratches, the dented metal. And then another photo, Martha standing there, flashlight in hand, her face captured mid-swing as she struck the vehicle. The pieces clicked into place. Ethan felt the surge of something dark and furious settle in his chest. "What the hell?" he muttered. The paramedic didn't say anything for a moment. Then finally he spoke. "We filed a police report," he said. "But I thought you should know first." Ethan stared at him, his heart monitor beeping steadily in the background. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than exhaustion. He felt rage. Ethan sat in the hospital bed, staring at the paramedic's phone screen. The images of the vandalized ambulance burned into his mind. It took a moment for his brain to fully process what he was looking at: deep scratches along the vehicle's side, the cracked headlight, and Martha frozen in mid-motion as she struck the emergency vehicle with her flashlight. The rage that settled in his chest wasn't the quick, fiery kind that made a man lash out immediately. It was slow-burning, calculated, the kind that made his fingers curl around the hospital sheets as he forced himself to take a steadying breath. He had spent years keeping his head down, avoiding unnecessary conflicts, keeping a careful distance from the ridiculous disputes that seemed to consume other people's lives. But this wasn't some petty neighborhood squabble about leaves in the yard or trash cans left out too long. This was different. The paramedic was watching him carefully, his arms crossed over his chest. "I figured you'd want to know before the police come by," he said evenly. "They'll want to take your statement, considering it happened during your emergency response." Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain level-headed. He had seen men ruin their own chances at justice by reacting too emotionally, by giving their opponents something to twist against them. Martha was exactly the type of person who would play the victim the second it suited her. If he stormed into this situation blindly, she'd spin it into something absurd, make it seem like he was harassing her, and claim that she was a helpless old woman being unfairly targeted. No, if he was going to do this, he had to be smart about it. "Thanks for letting me know," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I'll talk to the cops when they get here." The paramedics studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Just be careful. People like her, they don't go down quietly." Ethan didn't need to be told that. By the time the police arrived at the hospital, Ethan had already composed himself. The officer was a younger guy, early 30s, with the look of someone who had already decided how seriously he was going to take this case before he even walked into the room. Ethan could see it in his eyes, the mild disinterest, the assumption that this was just another minor property dispute between neighbors. The officer introduced himself, took out his notepad, and started with the usual questions. Ethan answered everything calmly, sticking to the facts, giving no room for interpretation or doubt. Yes, he had suffered a medical emergency. Yes, the ambulance had parked where it was necessary. No, Martha hadn't expressed any concern for his well-being, only for the inconvenience of having an emergency vehicle near her home. Yes, he had been unconscious when the vandalism occurred. Yes, he had been shown photographic evidence of the damage. The officer nodded along, scribbling notes, but when Ethan finished speaking, there was a long pause before he finally said, "We'll have to investigate before any charges can be filed." Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. "Investigate?" The officer shrugged, shifting his weight. "Ms. Collins has a different version of events. She claims the damage was already there before the ambulance arrived." A sharp laugh escaped before Ethan could stop it. "She hit the damn thing with a flashlight. There's a picture of her doing it." The officer nodded, as if Ethan had just told him the weather report. "Like I said, we'll investigate. If it turns out that she did, in fact, cause the damage, then appropriate measures will be taken." Ethan could feel the frustration simmering beneath his skin, but he forced himself to remain composed. He had seen this play out before. Officers not wanting to get involved in neighbor disputes, writing things off as minor incidents, trying to brush things under the rug to avoid the paperwork. But this wasn't something that could be ignored. He straightened slightly in the hospital bed, leveling the officer with a steady gaze. "I'll be requesting a copy of this report," he said evenly. "And I'll be following up on the progress of this investigation." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll make sure the necessary steps are taken." Ethan didn't believe him. By the time Ethan was discharged from the hospital the following afternoon, he had already made a decision. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for the police to drag their feet. He wasn't going to hope that Martha magically decided to do the right thing. He was going to ensure that there was no possible way for this to be ignored. The first thing he did when he got home was check his security cameras. Or at least, he tried to. When he pulled up the feed on his laptop, all he got was an error message. His brows furrowed as he checked the system logs. The cameras had gone offline for 3 hours, the exact time frame during which the ambulance had arrived. His hands tightened into fists. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone had tampered with them. His first thought was Martha. She was bold enough, brazen enough, petty enough. But as much as he wanted to believe she had done it, the technical aspect didn't fit. Martha was a menace, but she wasn't sophisticated. She didn't know how to disable a camera system without physically damaging it. And his cameras were intact, which meant someone else had done it. Ethan felt a cold sense of unease settle in his stomach. This was no longer just about a vandalized ambulance. Ethan picked up his phone and called the company that managed his security system. After explaining the situation, the technician on the other end of the line promised to run a diagnostic remotely. The response came back within minutes. His system hadn't been hacked remotely. It had been disabled from a physical access point. Someone had gotten close enough to interfere with it directly. Ethan hung up the phone, his mind racing. This was bigger than he thought. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think logically. He needed to proceed carefully. If he confronted Martha now, she'd deny everything and possibly try to escalate the situation further. If someone else had been involved, he needed to find out who. And most importantly, he needed to make sure he wasn't walking into something even more dangerous than he had anticipated. He made a second call to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time, but who he knew could help. "Danny," he said when the other man picked up. "I need a favor." Danny Holt had worked in private security for years, specializing in surveillance and forensic analysis. He wasn't a cop, but he was better in some ways. He actually cared about getting answers. "What's going on?" Danny asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Someone cut my security feed during a medical emergency, and I have a strong suspicion my neighbor is involved." There was a pause on the other end before Danny finally said, "All right, send me what you have. I'll take a look." Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Ethan sat in his living room, his hands pressed together, fingers interlocked, as he stared at the blank screen of his laptop. The weight of everything that had happened in the past 48 hours settled heavily on his shoulders. His near-death experience was already enough to process, but what had transpired outside his home while he was fighting to stay alive was something else entirely. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Martha's pettiness, nor was it about a simple case of vandalism. Someone had deliberately shut down his security cameras at the exact moment the ambulance arrived. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. He checked his phone, waiting for a response from Danny. When it finally came in, he exhaled sharply before answering. "I ran a diagnostic on your security logs," Danny said without preamble. "You were right. The system wasn't hacked remotely, and it wasn't a glitch. Someone accessed your network manually from the outside." Ethan clenched his jaw. "How close would they have to be?" Danny hesitated. "Within a few feet of your router, meaning they were either in your yard or right against the house." Ethan's fingers tightened around the phone. He already knew that whoever had done this had to be someone nearby, someone familiar with his property, someone who had access to the right tools and the audacity to interfere with his system in the middle of a medical crisis. Danny continued, his voice lower now. "Ethan, this isn't just some amateur move. This is someone who knew what they were doing. It wasn't just about disabling your cameras. It was about controlling the situation, making sure that whatever happened outside your house couldn't be traced back to them." Ethan ran a hand down his face. "Martha?" "I don't think so," Danny said, surprising him. "I mean, yeah, she's clearly an issue, but from what you've told me, she's loud and entitled, not technically skilled. Cutting a security feed like this isn't something she could pull off on her own. Someone helped her." Ethan felt the unease settle deeper. "You think she's working with someone?" "I think she either got help, or someone has a vested interest in keeping you in the dark." Ethan thought about that. Martha was manipulative, but she wasn't sophisticated. She was the type to throw a tantrum over a parked car, to vandalize a vehicle in a fit of rage, but not the type to execute a coordinated move like this. So who the hell had done it? Danny sighed on the other end. "I'm going to run some deeper scans. In the meantime, you need to play this smart. Don't tip her off. If she's in over her head, she might panic and do something reckless." Ethan nodded to himself. "Yeah, all right." He hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing now, trying to piece together the timeline, the motivations, the connections. Someone had taken the time to disable his security, but why? Was it just to make sure Martha's vandalism wasn't caught on tape? Or was it something more? The answer came sooner than he expected. That evening, as Ethan sat in his kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and debating his next move, there was a sharp knock at the door. He sat down the mug, his pulse already picking up. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he walked to the door, glancing through the peephole. "Martha." His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to take a steadying breath before unlocking the door and opening it just enough to see her. She stood there with a forced smile, her posture stiff, as if she were rehearsing something in her mind. "Ethan," she said, her voice artificially sweet. "I heard you were back from the hospital. I just wanted to check in, see how you were doing." Ethan stared at her. Was she serious? He didn't respond immediately, just let the silence stretch between them. Martha's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "You know, I was so worried when I saw the ambulance," she continued. "I had no idea what was happening. I hope everything's all right." Ethan kept his expression unreadable. She was testing the waters, trying to gauge how much he knew. "You were worried?" he asked, his voice flat. "Of course," she said quickly. "We're neighbors, after all. And, well, you know how much I care about this community." Ethan almost laughed at the audacity of it. She cared about the community? She had been more concerned about a parked ambulance than a dying man. Instead of calling her out directly, he played along. "That's good to know," he said. "Because the police came by earlier to discuss the damage done to the ambulance. They're investigating it now." Martha's expression flickered just for a second, but it was enough. Her eyes darted slightly to the side before she forced her face back into a mask of concern. "Oh, that's terrible," she said, feigning ignorance. "Vandalism is such an awful thing. I hope they find whoever did it." Ethan leaned against the door frame, watching her carefully. "They will," he said. "There's evidence. Clear, undeniable evidence." Martha's throat bobbed slightly as she swallowed. "Well," she said after a pause, "I just wanted to check in. Let me know if you need anything." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked briskly back to her house. Ethan shut the door, locking it behind him. She was rattled, that much was obvious. But was it because she was guilty, or was there more to it? And why the hell had someone disabled his security? The answers came the next morning. Danny called him, his tone sharp. "Ethan, you need to hear this." Ethan sat up straighter. "What did you find?" "I checked the logs again, and I found something buried in the system. Whoever disabled your cameras didn't just shut them down. They rerouted them. For 3 hours, your feed wasn't offline. It was redirected to another server." Ethan's stomach dropped. "You mean someone was watching?" Danny hesitated. "Not just watching. Recording." Ethan exhaled sharply, trying to process what that meant. Someone had taken control of his security cameras, making sure that instead of recording what happened outside his house, the footage was being stored somewhere else. But why? Who needed that footage? And then it hit him. What if the cameras weren't disabled to hide Martha? He said slowly. What if they were disabled to monitor something else? Danny was silent for a moment. Then, "That's what I'm worried about." Ethan's mind raced. Someone had orchestrated this. The question was, what were they looking for? And why was Martha suddenly so nervous? He wasn't sure yet, but he was damn sure going to find out. Ethan had always considered himself a rational man, someone who relied on logic and careful thinking rather than knee-jerk reactions. But as he sat at his kitchen table, his fingers tapping against the wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm, he couldn't ignore the simmering frustration building in his chest. The more pieces of this puzzle he put together, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a case of an entitled neighbor throwing a tantrum. Someone had hijacked his security system. Someone had rerouted his camera feed. Someone had been watching. And Martha, who had always been the queen of petty grievances, was now acting nervous, defensive, as if she knew more than she was letting on. Danny's discovery had changed everything. Before, Ethan had been focused on dealing with Martha's blatant vandalism, ensuring that she was held accountable for her actions. But now, the situation had taken on an entirely different weight. Whoever had tampered with his system hadn't done it just to cover for Martha. That much was obvious. No, this was bigger. Someone had been gathering information. Someone had been trying to see something, or someone. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose as he forced himself to think. His first instinct was to go back over every interaction he'd had with Martha in the past few months, searching for anything that might hint at what she could be hiding. She was controlling, territorial, obsessed with maintaining power over their neighborhood, but she wasn't careful. She liked being seen. She liked people knowing she was the one in charge. And yet, for the first time since he had known her, she had backed off. She had come to his door, all false concern and forced politeness, pretending she cared about his well-being. But what if she hadn't come just to check on him? What if she had been trying to gauge his level of awareness? What if she had been trying to see if he had figured out what was really going on? Ethan wasn't going to wait for her to make another move. If she was nervous, then he needed to push her further. The next morning, Ethan took a slow walk down their street, acting as if he were simply stretching his legs, getting fresh air, shaking off the lingering effects of his hospital stay. He nodded at a few neighbors, noting how some of them avoided his gaze, how others seemed to watch him for just a second too long before turning away. Word had gotten around. Martha had told her version of events, no doubt spinning the story to make herself seem like the victim. That was fine. Ethan wasn't interested in fighting a battle of gossip. He was interested in answers. As he neared Martha's house, he slowed his pace, scanning the property. Her blinds were partially drawn, but he could see the faint movement of a shadow inside. She was watching him. Good. Without hesitation, he stepped off the sidewalk and onto her driveway, walking straight up to her front door. He knocked twice, then took a step back, crossing his arms as he waited. A long pause. Then finally, the door opened just enough for Martha to peer out, her expression carefully controlled. "Ethan," she said, her voice overly casual. "Did you need something?" He didn't smile, didn't play along. "Yeah, actually," he said. "I wanted to talk about my security cameras." Her fingers twitched slightly against the door frame. "Oh, what about them?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction. "They were disabled the night I was taken to the hospital. Not just turned off, rerouted. Someone was recording from a different location." Martha's face barely changed, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a tightness around her mouth. "That sounds concerning." "It is," Ethan agreed, "especially since it happened at the exact moment the ambulance arrived." Silence stretched between them. Martha held her ground, but Ethan could see the tension in her posture, the way her weight had shifted slightly, as if preparing to retreat. "If you know something," he said, his voice calm but firm, "now's the time to tell me." Martha let out a short, forced laugh. "Ethan, I don't have the faintest idea what you're talking about. You always think the worst of me, but it's paranoid." Ethan didn't blink. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you're just a terrible liar." Martha's jaw tightened. "If you're going to accuse me of something, I suggest you bring proof." Ethan took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough that she had to strain to hear him. "You really think the people who did this won't turn on you the second they realize I'm getting too close?" For the first time, Martha's mask cracked, just slightly, just enough. Ethan didn't push further. He had planted the seed. Now he just had to wait. That night, his patience paid off. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the motion sensors on his remaining security cameras triggered an alert. Ethan, who had been lying awake in bed, sat up immediately, grabbing his phone to check the live feed. The screen showed a grainy black and white image of Martha standing at the edge of her property, looking up and down the street. She was dressed in dark clothing, her usual robe and slippers replaced with something more discreet. She was nervous. Ethan watched as she hesitated, then quickly moved toward the side of her house, disappearing from view. He switched cameras, tracking her movement. She wasn't going inside. She was heading toward her backyard. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched her approach a wooden fence, the one that separated her property from the narrow alley behind the row of houses. And then, just as she reached the fence, just as she moved to push it open, a figure emerged from the shadows. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the low resolution of the camera. He moved with purpose, stepping toward Martha as she hesitated, as if she had been expecting him but was still afraid. They exchanged words, too quiet for Ethan to hear, but the body language was clear. Martha was scared. The man was in control. Then, without warning, the man grabbed her arm. Martha flinched, yanking herself free, shaking her head as if rejecting whatever he had just said. The man stood still for a moment, then took a step closer. Martha stumbled back. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't know who the man was, but he knew one thing for certain. Martha wasn't calling the shots anymore. She had been pulled into something bigger than she could handle. And now, whether she liked it or not, she wasn't the one making the rules. Ethan watched as the man finally released her, as Martha hurried back toward her house, as the figure lingered for a moment before disappearing into the alley. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Martha had always been a problem, but now she was a loose end. And someone out there didn't like loose ends. Ethan didn't sleep after what he had seen. He sat in his living room, his phone resting on the table, the video feed frozen on the frame of Martha stumbling back from the man in the alley. He had replayed it over and over, analyzing every movement, every hesitation, every detail that might give him a clue about what the hell was really going on. The way she flinched when the man grabbed her. The way he loomed over her. The barely contained aggression in his stance. It was all so far removed from the image Martha projected to the world. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules, the one who made others feel small. But now, she had looked terrified. That meant something. That meant leverage. At 7 a.m., Ethan stepped outside, his coffee in hand, his body exhausted but his mind sharper than ever. The neighborhood was quiet, the early morning air still and cool. He glanced over at Martha's house, half expecting to see her peering through the blinds like she always did, but there was nothing. No sign of her. That wasn't like her. Ethan crossed the street and knocked on her door. He wasn't sure what he expected. Another fake smile, another attempt at pretending she wasn't unraveling. But when the door finally opened, Martha didn't even try to hide it. She looked like hell. Her usually immaculate hair was a mess. Dark circles sat under her eyes, and her skin had taken on a pale, almost sickly tone. For the first time in all the years he had known her, she looked genuinely vulnerable. "Ethan," she said, her voice hoarse. He studied her carefully. "Rough night." Martha didn't respond right away. She glanced past him, scanning the street, as if making sure they weren't being watched. Then, with a sharp inhale, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." That was unexpected. Ethan hesitated, but only for a second. Then he stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. Martha didn't bother with small talk. She walked straight into the kitchen, rubbing her hands over her face before leaning against the counter. For a moment, she just stood there, her fingers gripping the edge of the marble like she needed to steady herself. Then she exhaled. "They're watching me," she said quietly. Ethan didn't react immediately. He just let the words sit between them. "Who?" he asked finally. Martha let out a humorless laugh. "Does it matter?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. "It does to me." Martha closed her eyes for a second before looking at him again. There was something different in her gaze now, not just fear, but resignation. She knew she had backed herself into a corner. "It started with small things," she said. "A favor here, a connection there. Nothing illegal, nothing serious, just helping things move along." Ethan didn't speak. He let her keep going. Then it got bigger. Documents needed to disappear. People needed to be pressured into selling their homes. And I let it happen because I thought I was still in control. She let out a shaky breath, her hands tightening against the counter. "But I never was." Ethan already knew that. "Who's the guy from last night?" he asked. Martha flinched at the mention of it. "You saw?" "I saw." She swallowed hard, her fingers twitching slightly. "I don't know his name. He doesn't use one. But I know what he does. If someone stops being useful, if someone talks too much," she exhaled sharply, "they disappear." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. This wasn't just corruption. This wasn't just some petty abuse of power. This was something worse. "So why are you still here?" he asked. Martha's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I don't have a choice." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, Ethan saw something in her that almost resembled regret. "You should leave this alone, Ethan," she said. "I mean it." But Ethan had never been the kind of man who could walk away from something like this. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "No," he said. "No, I don't think I will." Martha exhaled, shaking her head. "Then you'd better be ready for what comes next." Ethan didn't respond. He just turned and walked out the door. As he stepped back into the morning light, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan didn't go back inside his house right away. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring down the quiet, sunlit street, letting the weight of the morning settle in his chest. He had walked into Martha's house expecting to get under her skin, to push her into making a mistake, to force her to reveal something he could use against her. But what he had found instead was a woman who was already drowning, barely keeping herself afloat in something much deeper and darker than he had anticipated. He should have felt satisfied, maybe even vindicated, after all the hell she had put him through. But instead, he felt something closer to unease. Martha was scared, and fear made people dangerous. He walked back to his house, his steps slower than before. His mind was already working through the possibilities, trying to piece together the timeline of what had really been happening in this neighborhood. Martha had admitted to covering up documents, to pressuring people into selling their homes. But for who? Who was powerful enough to make her, someone who thrived on control, bend to their will? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. He picked up his phone and called Danny. "I need you to pull records on property transfers in this area over the last 5 years," Ethan said without preamble when Danny answered. There was a beat of silence, then Danny sighed. "You really don't know how to let things go, do you?" Ethan didn't answer. Danny exhaled through his nose. "Fine. I'll look." But if I find something, you'd better be ready to handle it. Ethan didn't say it out loud, but he already was. By the time the sun had set, Danny had sent him a file, dozens of names, dates, and transaction histories. Ethan scrolled through them, his eyes scanning for patterns. And then he found it. Nearly a dozen homes, all sold under suspicious circumstances, all bought by shell companies that traced back to a single investment group. And at the center of it all, buried beneath layers of paperwork and false identities, was a name he recognized. Elliot Grayson. The same Elliot Grayson who had been quietly buying up commercial property on the outskirts of town. The same Elliot Grayson who had been pushing new zoning laws to reclassify residential areas into mixed-use developments. The same Elliot Grayson who, 10 years ago, had been under federal investigation for fraud before the case had mysteriously disappeared. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't just Martha. It never had been. She was just another pawn. The next morning, Ethan was up early, watching Martha's house from his window. She hadn't left since their conversation. No car in the driveway, no movement behind the curtains. Just silence. And then, just after 9 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched a man step out. Tall, well-dressed, the kind of expensive haircut that screamed wealth and power. Even from a distance, Ethan could tell this wasn't just some errand boy. This was someone who made decisions. Martha answered the door almost immediately, and the man stepped inside without hesitation. Ethan didn't hesitate either. He grabbed his keys and walked out, heading straight for the only place where he knew he could put all of this in motion, the police station. Walking through those doors, he expected resistance. He expected the same disinterest he had been met with before. But this time, he wasn't coming in with a vandalism complaint. He was coming in with documents, with names, with connections that the department couldn't afford to ignore. It took over an hour, talking, explaining, laying everything out in clear detail. He knew they wouldn't act immediately. Bureaucracy moved slowly. But when he left that building, he knew he had planted something that couldn't be ignored. By the time he got home, the SUV was gone. But Martha's door was open, and that unease in his chest turned into something colder. Ethan approached cautiously, stepping inside. The house was silent, empty, and on the kitchen counter, there was a single envelope with his name on it. He picked it up, opening it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. "I told you to leave it alone. Now I don't have a choice." Ethan's grip tightened on the paper. Martha was gone. Whether she had left on her own or had been forced, he didn't know. But he knew what this meant. It meant he was next. Ethan stood in the empty house, the note crumpled in his hand. The weight of everything that had happened, the lies, the manipulation, the danger, settled heavily on his shoulders. He had started this journey seeking justice for a petty act of vandalism, but he had uncovered something far more sinister. Martha had been a pawn in a much larger game, and now, so was he. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man who could walk away. He had always been a man of logic, of discipline, of structure. And now, he would use those traits to fight back. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he stepped back into the sunlight, Ethan Carter prepared himself for the battle ahead. The quiet man was ready to make some noise. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.